Welcome to the first of the Smuts lecture series called Afterlives Colonial. I am Ashley, I'm head of geography and also chair of the Smuts Fund, which supports Commonwealth studies at Cambridge through a range of initiatives. One new venture for us is this lecture series, where every 2 years we bring a distinguished scholar to address the question of the post-colonial and what kind of new life should be breathed into post-colonial studies. And then they come here, they give 3 lectures, after which we have an agreement with Poetry Press where the lectures will be turned into a short book in the course of time, within a year or so. In spring 2019, we'll be welcoming the historian Mr. Chakrabarti, but tonight it's my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce our inaugural speaker, Professor AbdouMaliq Simone, who is research chair at the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen. He's renowned, well, most of you will know this because his work is very well known. He's renowned for his work on how the poor and working people in general managed to cobble together a life in the cities of the global south. How they managed to get things done under the radar of the state, under the radar of the known, under the radar of the expected. And this work of his has drawn on years of research in Douala, in Lagos, in Jakarta, and in Dhaka. And this work has been based on collaboration with all kinds of actors on the ground, communities themselves, religious leaders, youths, and sometimes, often enough, also with planners. And in my view, the result of all of this is a really rich vein of theory, very much from the ground up, slowly shifting our understanding of how cities work away from a Eurocentric model of the city. His books, especially his book in 2004, The City Yet to Come, and his recent book on Jakarta, which came out in 2015, I have to say, have already become very celebrated texts. And in his 3 lectures in Cambridge, tonight, this Thursday, next Monday, same time, same place, these lectures will draw on new material from Jakarta, Hyderabad, and Delhi. And in these lectures, I think an important concept is the notion, intriguing notion, of the uninhabitable, which he'll mobilize and develop to throw light on the hidden, the occluded relations that make life for the world's majorities possible. So finally, we have an account of majority lives that doesn't resonate with most mainstream accounts of life in the global south. So we please join me in warmly welcoming AbdouMaliq Simone.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Smuts Foundation, Smuts Fund, for this opportunity. Thanks for coming out tonight in the rain. Tonight is a little bit of an experiment because I'm going to speak about some things I've never spoken about, at least in public, before. So I'm not sure how it's going to go down. Sometimes I feel like I'm between being kind of kicked out of Octavia Butler's Certainly Not Bolshevik Paradise and trying to get home to Toni Morrison's Paradise. And somehow in between, full of very kinds of murky entities and investment funds and tax shelters. So in some ways, this is a kind of version of a Paradise Papers in some way. I will undertake in these 3 lectures to convey a sense of the urban as uninhabitable. Now, this is not intended as a totalizing conception of urban life, but rather to identify within it spaces and times which, in their inability to be precisely measured or scaled, where the vectors of here and now, of here and there, now and then are largely indistinguishable, provide some kind of rhythm of endurance. I emphasize the notion of rhythm, since this is not an endurance attached to particular conditions or place, such as to endure the present or to endure the Anthropocene. Rather, cities and other manifestations of urbanization afford a certain resourcefulness as a vibrating topography, a means of associating, intersecting, that is neither stabilized nor developed, but always moving on, even in highly circumscribed spaces. While so many forces are at work to make habitation impossible, or nearly impossible, in many urban contexts, I invoke the uninhabitable to point to practices of living with the urban, living with all of its intensifications, extension, ambiguities, and apocalyptic implications. Living with it as something strange, seemingly impermeable to calculation or figuring. As such, this living with is an arena of inexplicable conjunction, collaboration, unsettling. It's a profusion of undomesticated circulating details, momentarily coalescing as affirmations, instigations of something else besides right next to the otherwise resounding drudgery and bleakness of contemporary urbanization, and its accelerating repetition of limiting formats and implosive horizons. A repetition that seems to promise to destroy us, no matter how much we have been in the dark about such matters from the get-go. But even in this repetition, even in the apparent homogenization of urban landscapes, the repetition occasions apertures of differing, neither attributable to a specific event or to an actor. What takes us to the same place at the same time also takes us someplace else. Not as a determinable destination, but as an accompaniment, a modality of passage, something always something else along the way. It is not the traces that are important, nor the arrival, even as places are increasingly plundered and available for any kind of extraction. As soon as you try to identify this uninhabitable accompaniment, this modality of passage and interchange, it has moved on, and so have you, temporarily aligned and allied. The politics of the uninhabitable here is not a representation of the way things are, but rather an incitement to produce new ways of narrating what might be taking place besides that which is already narrated as the story of things. For domains, districts, sectors, institutions, populations, and identities in the city are always moving across each other. Their operations are always interstitial, in that the space in which they act upon each other seldom exclusively belongs to a single domain or a single time. The exingent mixes with the obdurate, bureaucratic lags intersect with arbitrary decisions, and memories pile up amongst erasures. Nothing stays put even when some environments seem to register hardly any change at all for decades. Individuating and agglomerating interests are constantly being mixed up. The uninhabitable, set free from the conditions of unfreedom that anchor judgments about what is to be considered habitable or not, about whose habitation is worthy or not in particular circumstances, and dissociated from the ambiguities of the enactment of habitation, is thus not only a living with, but a living without a discernible world, and thus something without apparent scale. Perhaps it is the urban itself, but this is something I will talk about in later lectures. But in other words, for now, I'm interested in the way that the urban constitutes a surface, a tissue of articulation that enjoins each experience and actor to each other in ways that go beyond the capacity to map, measure, and account for their relationships. But at the same time, in Luciana's Parisi's terms, it is in the very operations of calculating what it is and how it acts, what she calls the way the doing is done, that the enactment of the urban then leads to something else. And this is not a place of inhabitation. Rather, it is an ensemble of enactments that ramify across the surface where everything and everyone is potentially reachable and affected. I will attempt to think through various instantiations of the urban through this plane of affecting. In the film of Salome Lamas, so in Salome Lamas' film Alvarado 21 of 2016, the everyday life of artisanal gold miners in the nearly mineral-depleted area of La Rinconada, Peru, is documented from primarily a stationary camera, recording at night the relentless movement up and down of miners along the mountain. Nearly half of the film visually is this seemingly Sisyphus circulation of bodies. Inhabitation in the film is portrayed as a constant unsettling, a refusal and an impossibility to stand still, and the exigency to keep on moving, no matter whether the moving has any particular function or not, whether or not it does anything or not. But for what purpose is this movement? The audio track, which is different from there's the film track and then there's an audio track, which is its own parallel reality. The audio track pursues the relentless details of how to get money, how to find a place to live, how to mine, how to offer the costly sacrifices to the spirits of the mountains that might guarantee either success or persistence through failure. The informants of the film offer these accounts with breathtaking speed and confidence. They trace every detail and increment of their conversion into the very thing they came to the mountain to avoid. That is, their utter destitution that would turn them into monsters. But at the same time, their accounts are always generous and generative. For in contrast to the mobility on the mountainside upon which the camera is fixated, this constant circulation of bodies, trapped in a ritualistic and indistinct conjunction of labor, prayer, emancipation, and capture, the audio track instead voices the elaboration of a methodical instantiation of individual and collective life on this difficult terrain. This is terrain on which an entire city spreads out into the horizon, engendering a sociality centered on frequent festivity and the conviviality of women who smoke and chew cocoa leaf and talk about all of the things that could and probably will kill them, as well as their detailed understandings of the political machinations that undergird this. So the uninhabitable is not the negation of the social, even if it constantly queries what that social is. So I do not depreciate the ways in which the ubiquity of social suffering can constitute the basis of an afterlife, of attaining a capacity to deal with suffering and violence in ways that both adeptly and awkwardly navigate the contradictions between protection and aspiration, justice and strategic indifference, or between the haunting of the past and the opportunities to make life anew. Rather, the uninhabitable becomes the very condition of the inhabitable, as any attempt to instantiate oneself in place in a world depends upon its position within an ensemble of performances generated from different directions, entities, and forces. The uninhabitable thus concerns practices of being here and there, of ways of doing that are dependent upon knowing how all those others anticipate you knowing and treating them, and incorporating those anticipations into whatever it is that you observe. Thus, you respond in a way that seeks not to confirm such anticipations, but to generate the conditions through which they might be transformed. This is a situation then where everyone is out of place, on the move, but still capable of neighborly relations, still capable of tending to each other with both care and indifference. Space is accorded to each without definitive judgment. I want to initially engage this situation of being out of place, but still capable of neighborly relations, as ensemble work. And here I draw upon the substantial work of Fred Moten and his work on the ensemble, where he says ensembles of improvisation located in seemingly unbridgeable chasm between feeling and reflection, disarmament and preparation, but improvisation in whatever possible excess of representation that appears in whatever probable deviance of form always operates as a kind of foreshadowing, if not a prophetic description. The notion of ensemble work takes its cue from the concept of harmonics that Ornette Coleman applied to his music. This is a way of playing where melody is not superseded by harmony, where the democracy of the ensemble was such that each player could deliver the melody in its own configuration of rhythm and chord changes. Harmonic modulation is the method of moving at the same time, moving the same written notes from one clef to another in order to yield various names, which is then accompanied by a parallel modulation where the same notes are played on different instruments in order to realize various sounds. So each player basically plays the same thing in different key changes, different notes, different registers, different instruments, in this kind of sameness, but a democracy that allows each one to do the same in a kind of different way, and thus contribute to the notion of the ensemble as something which is both less than two, and more than one. So the following vignettes that make up the rest of tonight's presentation attempt to operate as a kind of ensemble. So this ensemble will play out some of the variety of rhythms and sounds of what I'm trying to call the uninhabitable. Before, in the second lecture, I will delve more systematically into how the uninhabitable manifests itself in contemporary urban southern spaces. But for now, the players in this ensemble will ironically stay close to home. They will stay close to the places that they come from, even if these places have been left a long time ago, left to their own devices without the players. So part one of the ensemble. Freetown. I have long dealt in the coming together of those who otherwise would seem to live their lives apart. At various times, what got conjoined might include the inconsolable, those whose suffering was interminable, or the always perspiring power brokers willing to turn their backs in the obsessions with the backside, or the doleful bureaucrat, or the activist capable of gathering up the leftovers of seemingly ruined struggles, or the street-smart thug reluctant to live up to the reputations of violence, or the armies of domestic managers who see everything in the provision of the most minimal of service. While their paths toward each other are often specified and formatted, there is always something that exceeds the normative dispositions of their contact. While so much in urban life repeats the flirtations with catastrophe and the cheap gestures of redemption, pockets of interminacy, rest, and care, where no one has to decide anything immediately, no one has to play their cards right away, these things are also regenerating. Opportunities for temporary respite are passed along, as are overtures, feelers, hesitant invitations, small lures, all of which beckon residents otherwise separated by the most minimal yet stringent divides to take note of something surprising and useful when they do find themselves taking note of each other. I say this in part because my own urban work, taking notes back and forth to various residents of Freetown, where I spent much of my childhood, it was a kind of part-time job based on my fascination with musical innovations and how notes could be played. My early obsession with Coltrane, Coleman, Taylor, and Shep. I moved to Freetown 7 years before Sierra Leone's official independence in 1961. But for all practical purposes, the British were largely gone. I came with an embittered, always ambivalently communist mother who seemed to intentionally mess up the filling of her U.S. immigration forms and who had been disowned by her Bedouin father for marrying the son of a Camorra assassin hiding out in Italian-occupied Tripoli. Both parents had jobs teaching at a Methodist school, which both my younger brother and I attended. We lived in one of a series of apartment buildings my mother's cousin had built for residents of nearby Congo Town, whose clapboard houses were beyond repair, who aspired to a more modern life beyond the patter of ghosts, heavy rains, constant rumors, and grueling local politics. In the early days, between ages 5 and 8, outside of attending school, I largely stayed indoors, feeling neither smart nor tough enough to deal with crowded lanes below, where everything, cooking, laundering, seducing, fighting, praying, took place outdoors. As both my brother and I had been accidentally born with some kind of advanced musical competence, we spent a lot of time playing the piano at a church in the back of the apartment block, the janitor always lending the keys in exchange for hiding bottles of whiskey under our beds, out of sight from his fanatically teetotaling wife. Every summer, my brother and I were sent to Detroit for the obligatory 2-month visits to my mother's father, who had joined the Arab cavalcade to the automobile factories and spent the entirety of his annual 2-week vacation break trying to turn us into good Muslims. Fortunately, he always fell asleep early, so my brother and I would sneak out of the windows, wander out on the nearby streets full of clubs and cinemas, and plan our eventual escape into America, where we both felt we should have been all along if only we could find a way to knock some sense into our crazy mother. But Freetown did change for both of us, or rather, despite our limitations. The summer of Solonian independence, I brought back Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come, along with Coltrane's Giant Steps, promised a sea change in music, as eventful as the wave of new nations coming into being across West Africa. In Coleman's music, there were no bars, no background. Melody wasn't overshadowed by harmony. With the quartet, John Cherry on trumpet, Charlie Hayden on bass, Billy Higgins on drums, there was real democracy. Each player could deliver the melody in his own configuration of rhythm and chord changes, make a claim to lead the way. As I mentioned earlier, Ornette would call this harmolodics, where the same notes were written in different clefs for the same or different instruments, thus modulating the sound. There didn't need to be an underpinning. There didn't need to be a ground in which different ways of playing would be based. You could play the game in your own way, as long as you recognized the tune, as long as you charted out a path that everyone else could potentially follow. So no disjuncture, no antagonisms, just switches. Of course, I didn't really appreciate this theory at that age, But I listened to the record a million times, and through it found a way to wander Freetown streets with the confidence I inexplicably felt in Detroit. I would listen to the conversations of both kids and adults around me and simply repeat and mix up the words they uttered without really changing the meaning, but at the same time opening up the possibility that they could hear or say something else with the repetition, or that someone else standing around might take a different kind of notice to what was being said by the way in which it was being repeated. Then there was the matter of style and intonation. I had also brought back that same summer a copy of Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain and immersed myself in the story of the 14-year-old street corner preacher and styled my delivery by imagining a Southern Baptist swagger. Even though many people in Freetown regularly attended church, sometimes every day, sometimes even the Muslims, many prided themselves on not being anything like Black Americans. And here was this white boy taking up space on the street with some impoverished imitations. People didn't know what to make of my gestures. Some got angry, some were amused, most were simply irritated. But I persisted as if this was the only way to create a pocket of both safety and engagement. And after a while, people in the neighborhood simply got used to this crazy kid with a crazy mother and a father whose diplomatic skills and exceedingly good looks were sufficient to constantly smooth over the rough spots. My father really had his job cut out from him, because my brother's ploy was to sneak out to the kitchens of the big elite families and regale the staff with his versions of Hollywood show tunes on a toy piano he got for his 7th birthday. Eventually, neighbors would come to me asking me if I would deliver a message to a local ward leader, a pastor, a Lebanese merchant to whom money might be owed, or a school teacher, or another neighbor now acting in their capacity as lodge leader, moneylender, mystic, or someone with army connections. I would be instructed to deliver the message largely verbatim, but to add my usual twists and improvisations on the basic melody of the message so that it could later be claimed that as a kid I had gotten it wrong, or as my reputation for distortion started to precede me, that there was to be some leeway in what was being promised or permitted or requested. Oftentimes I delivered handwritten notes with the sender's request that the recipient not respond in writing, or if they insisted that I should claim that I lost it along the way. The reasons why this disjointed form of interchange took off were beyond me. I simply enjoyed the small remuneration and the structure it provided, going back and forth across different parts of the city, equipped with a mission, a foreign courier that really could not be completely trusted, but also someone who had no deep social connections, who didn't really have a voice of their own, simply a capacity to rearrange what others said, a cipher on the move. After all, it was Freetown, and in a free town, one is free to say exactly what they want. Now the issue here would seemingly be, well, who is the they, and how do you tell exactly what it is that they want? But such identification didn't seem to concern me as I remember it now. They were simply a they. This didn't mean that I didn't already know or get to know many of the neighbors that sent me on these missions. I had at least a rough idea of their relative positions and reputations in the neighborhood. I sort of knew their inclinations toward bluster or laughter. I knew their inflated or modest claims for themselves, or even the things they wished to keep from being widely known. But I just didn't concern myself with this knowledge. Every message had its own formula, regardless whether I had a sense of what they wanted to convey, and the formula was detached from the contextual background. For its only history was to switch up the delivery just slightly from whatever the message was prior to the one at hand. It was to be a self-contained system. The same went for the recipient. It didn't matter to me who they were. They were simply another they. a kind of generic figure, a sender-recipient becoming sender to a recipient. It was the back and forth that I paid attention to. It was how to go from here to there that I wanted to get right, and not to think about the form or content of the message itself. It wasn't that I didn't recognize or care about who all these they were as personalities. It wasn't that I didn't recognize them as living and breathing residents with their joys and sufferings, or their appreciation or criticism of my so-called work. Having looked back at this time during subsequent years in my preoccupation intellectually with the possibilities of opacity, and my dislike of anything with the word transparent in it, as well as my own long-term residencies in various domains of the black world, and the complicated racial politics I faced in those residencies, this declination of recognition, this compression of vast differences into a single character, the they, was perhaps less a dismissal of the singular features of their personhood than a gesture of respect to the openness of what the exchange could entail. At least in retrospect, this is how I spin it. This is what I would want from having acquired this history. As long as they were just they, there was nothing to inhabit, no measuring of the divides, the relative statuses of the participants, no tracing out of their networks, their prior or subsequent connections to each other. It was a task with its own time, detached from the ins and outs and cacophony of calls and responses of the city, weighted with so much freight and humidity. Whatever alliances the act of passing notes also pointed to, whatever it sutured and ruptured, were to remain strange. The people and places involved could remain familiar. The relationships based on histories of familiarity, on the details of how each was ensconced in the everyday life of the city, they would always continue to prevail. The pounding, bearing down, expiring, birthing, demanding, and supplicating, all of this would continue to characterize the uneven affordances and opportunities of Freetown. Yet this task was to be a moment of strangeness in the familiar, not as a place to be lived, occupied, settled, colonized, sustained, or endured, but whose sheer existence was just to be noted, always the shape of the city to come. With two crazy kids and a wife increasingly involved as labor organizer in the teachers' union, and a mother trying to reorganize the Mazzini movement in Cicero, my father seemed to make sure that the immigration problem suddenly disappeared. And by junior high school, we were in Chicago, where a different career in passing messages would begin in 1967. But this is another story for another time. This diversion to a biographic note is meant only to cite the purported origins of a particular methodology as an urban researcher, specializing in the conjunctions of the disconsonant, working in the spaces not habitable in any clear terms. Part 2, the spiral and the scene of the crime. My grandfather, Giovanni Battista, seemed impervious to starting again, even though his life was enacted across several continents. Alone, he was very, very much alone. But in his head, he was always returning to the scene of the crime, a crime in the shadows of La Chiesa della Immacolata Concezione e Purificazione de Maria de Nobili in Montecavallo. A killing, the husband of a woman with whom he had a child, unclaimed by both he and the husband, a virgin birth, a birth review scale, a birth that my grandfather referred to as the beast. The husband was purportedly an important camarista, the Neapolitan mafia, my grandfather a pretender, orphaned at a young age from a lower bourgeois family, bringing himself up on the streets of the rough and tumble quartieri spagnoli. He ended up a day laborer in Cicero, the self-incorporated and at the time all-white township in the heart of Greater Chicago. Cicero acted as the common backyard for rackets across the city and a haven for factories needing to launder money and skirt unionization. At night, he rented out his violence to collect overdue loans, parading around in borrowed suits and cheap cigars. As he resented the fact that my father was his mother's confidant and frequently protector, he started imposing his secrets upon me early on, secrets that were never otherwise acknowledged by other kin or associates. After all, he had inexplicably made it to America, a man with little money, few connections, having worked as a dock worker in colonial Tripoli in an escape from Naples. He kept telling me that I had to return to the scene of the crime, to find out what happened to the child he didn't want to have anything to do with, to determine whether it was time for him to return home, whether people remembered him, even though he couldn't be specific as to exactly what minds he wanted the memory of him to occupy. Although he never earned much, had 10 children to support, he constantly threw his money away, pretending to be a boss in games that already had too many bosses. My grandmother, on the other hand, with largely Mazzini anarchist sympathies, pulled her entire side of the family out of the Catholic Church and started a Protestant one. She pursued lost causes, such as the racial integration of this once bulwark of white homogeneity and the curtailment of municipal corruption. I rarely heard my grandparents speak to each other, and most of the words my grandfather uttered were directed to somewhere far away, certainly to no one in the present vicinity. The center of gravity was elsewhere, and in some ways every place becomes the scene of a crime. This is perhaps what places have in common, that allow even the far away and the suppressed to have something to say about everywhere else. There is no need to deliberate about the relevance of messages carried by the wind or waves from remote corners, for they played their part in whatever happened. The crime spreads like dark ink, creating distorted images invoked to tease out the unconscious connections to the outside long repressed. All the containment and erasures, all the ruined ground cannot deter a spiraling of remainders that eventually land someplace, that lure the attention of those who would rather look away. Those present who appear to be right in front of us may already be somewhere else, may have abandoned ship even as their bodies register a corporeal presence. Others may have long been gone, but who nevertheless have left traces behind that can't be erased. Our fascination with forensic evidence is the fascination with the possibility that crimes have been committed even when there is no discernible indication of them. I've been many times to the steps of the Chiesa Immacolata, preferably at dusk with a spliff in hand, and all I see are the wild rides of young girls and boys on Vespas up and down the steep inclines, indifferent to whatever is in their way, even as they may recognize that there is no way out, that all martyrdom is cheap, that history has hemmed them in, but they don't care. For them, there is no crime. The anthropologist Jason Pine has written about the notion of contact zones as a means of creating the atmosphere of Naples. He has written about the epistemological and ontological murk through which the figurations of Camorra merge and recede. It is that murk in which multiple claims to sovereignty are made, various social strands and networks enrolled in what appears to be a solid organization, and it is in that murk that convoluted territories of operation are marked out. Through his repetition of a popular Neapolitan expression, "Who am I for you and who are you for me?" he amplifies the indeterminacy of clear categorizations of what is criminal or political or informal or formal or licit or illicit. Neapolitan history has long demonstrated ways in which multiple contestations of political power are narrated through reifying the divisions between the bourgeois and the dangerous classes and the ways in which their actual entanglements get done. Well, of course, there are established ways of talking about things that enable clear identifications of who people indeed are for each other. Our striving to unfold seemingly divergent practices and styles and actors and backgrounds into enhancements of collective force and personal sovereignty tend to align and circumvent definitive determinations. We are often full of drama, trying to reach the practicalities of managing the situation in hand, reading into things much more than they are capable of revealing. We like to turn everyday life into telenovelas and exaggeration. Yet, as Jason Pine says, truths are made by the pressure these melodramas apply to the surface of real situations. These melodramas happen in ethnographic atmospheres, in the jangle of loud melodies and jarring words and flamboyant gestures, pressing bodies and them and me sizing up each other. These atmospheres hover with potential, hang like fog, or simply dissipate. They don't allow events to be followed to their completion or depletion. We make our way using the melodramatic mode of attention. And with a sliding scale of irony, we reach for personal sovereignty. Each place becomes the site of a crime, an infraction, a disavowal of prevailing moral terms, as each place slides away from precise designations and ordering. Something is disrupted in the very act of attempting to define or defend what a place is, or to find one's own place within a given situation. Whatever forensic tools we might bring to the scene to examine the invisible traces of the critical event, there can be no recuperation, no returning the scene to a situation of clarity. Such recuperation would only accentuate the vulnerability of the seemingly innocuous and innocent to a transgression beyond all reason. For it is only in transgression that we familiarize ourselves with ways of occupying a space beyond all the imposed definitions. For the lure of a place, that which is its gravitational pull, its wealth of secrets, is not located in the place itself, but rather something else besides it, ever so near, but a nearness that cannot be measured in the customary indications of distance. After all, for some place to exist on its own, as detached from any prevailing interpretive gaze, it will have to ensure that what it points to as its own singular contributions are kept far away from investigators scouring each corner of the place for clues. Pine talks about people who do not know each other, how they gauge the possibilities of having something to do with each other, and about how they locate themselves in a web of connections that doesn't stand still, that spirals out the more they attempt to feel each other out. In some way, this is about finding out what the interlocutors have in common. But the historical account about what they have in common is not really interesting to them in their own terms. What is more important are the things that they might have in common, about what their relationship might be. This is an investigation that begins with a specific place or set of persons, but it's not interested in remaining in that place. It is an investigation more interested in the ways that a place or set of persons might reach the here and now of people beginning to talk to each other through the rituals of verifiable familiarity. Do they indeed have something in common besides the conversation right now? Do they have something in common that is sufficient to act with a sense of commonality somewhere else, some other time in the future? Can references to the past spiral into something else in the future? So in Pine's account, if you know Gigi the glassmaker, then you must also know Louisa, his neighbor. I won't read this, but you get the point about a kind of feeling each other out, that doesn't stay where it is, but spirals out into, oh, well, if you know this, then you must know this, and then, oh yeah, and this is not in some ways to ascertain a kind of commonality in the present as much as it constitutes a kind of platform. Is that this commonality sufficient that we might be able to do something else with each other, some other place, in some other time, and yet have this kind of sense of commonality as a kind of basis in which to deal with each other. So it is a kind of investigation where any scene of the crime of being here in the same place, spirals out somewhere else. But also at some point, investigations exhaust themselves. Investigations turn inward and eliminate everything in their way, as the original crime sucks in everything around it. Gomorrah, the popular Italian television show about the Gomorrah, points to a different kind of spiraling, a kind of violence, a mutual indebtedness, an attachment to place that spirals out of control, where inhabitants of a highly defined yet fought-for territories increasingly simply become ghosts. So they fight to defend a territory at all costs in order for them to be able to recognize themselves, but in the end they just simply turn themselves into ghosts that don't even have a territory to operate in. At the end of season 2, the only two figures left standing are the two protagonists that attempted to take each other out at the end of season 1. One is Gennaro, son of Don Pietro, who was imprisoned, feigned dementia for years, escaped, and who then was secretly holed up in a fake apartment in one section of Naples, trying to reconsolidate his lost power in Secondigliano by fostering divisions in the Alliance, an always makeshift collection of different crews, none of which could consolidate overarching control in Don Pietro's absence. Gennaro, the son, who miraculously survived an attempt on his life, went to Honduras to make drug connections and then established himself in Rome, always trying to avoid getting sucked back into Naples politics and the authority of his father. But he does not really become part of the Roman family, even though he marries the daughter of its chief and then sells him out to the police because he wants to be what he calls his own protagonist, someone not rooted either here nor there. The second figure, Ciro, the guy who almost killed Gennaro, is the maniacal brains behind the Alliance, who eventually loses both wife and young daughter to the local wars. He is the last of the Alliance to still be alive at the end of season 2, and the guy who Gennaro had let live after being ordered by his father to kill him, and who refused to take his revenge. Upon his defeat by a resurrected Don Pietro, Ciro realizes that he has to leave Naples, leave the scene behind. Yet, with the son's complicity, Ciro kills the father, just at that point when Pietro reemerges into public as announcing the reconsolidation of his power. Naples, in the intensity of its obsession with locale, its obsession with blood, betrayal, passion, family, and faith. The way local leaders, no matter how rich they are, continue to live in its dilapidated social housing, in the end, endures only in its abandonment. Only the two figures that then are no longer there, who abandon its scale, are capable of living with it, but not of it. Not inhabiting Naples, but able to endure as it in some place, able to endure as Naples in some place that is neither refuge, exile, nor death. Again, a kind of uninhabitable space. Part 3, Chicago. Englewood, Chicago was the neighborhood of my youth. Back in the 1960s, It was largely a mixed lower working class neighborhood of detached houses, small apartments, and substantial municipal neglect. White people were leaving fast. The declining population hosted an increasing volume of vacant lots and trashed houses. But there were pockets of relative tranquility. These became spaces of temporary respite for gang leaders, come political activists, overburdened with the wars engendered by dirty cops and FBI agents in the neighborhoods just to the north. Residents set up daycare and feeding programs, alternative academies, and temporary shelters. They helped kids living in the overcrowded Robert Taylor homes in Bronzeville to find rentals. Local community development associations applied to all kinds of federal and state housing programs to stave off dereliction, all to little avail. I left long before the worst was to come, before Englewood became infamous as the icon for mindless homicides spiraling out of control, before Cabrini Green and a host of other housing projects were torn down, piling up surrounding neighborhoods with keenly territorialized economies now deprived of their territories. As the city continued to pull the plug on funds for basic education and social services, as the supply chains of narcotics played fast and loose with their retinues, and as long-honed institutions of the street were undermined by incarcerating their boards and directors, Englewood was turned into a prison without walls. Back in my time, we had loved ones we could rely on. While they may have worked the streets, they did so as their fathers had worked the factories, with a sense of discipline, regularity, and solidarity. From the disciples to the Black Keystone Nation, the street not only pursued its usual array of messy business, but was also a university campus, whose students were expected to study the wisdom of the ancients, the systems of contemporary rule, the histories of the people, and the fundamentals of revolutionary economy. As in all loosely associated collective efforts operating under and above the radar, the gangs had their frictions and fissions, but the violence, hard and heavy as it was, seemed always circumscribed, reluctantly executed. In the long contentious milieu of the South Side, those promising days where church, gang, local warring machine, Nation of Islam, community associations, and Black Panthers were stitched together as a functional quilt in a resurgent Black urban life proved way too much for the Windy City. So all the trumped-up charges were set in motion, all those efforts to drive wedges and stakes. When Elijah, a loved one, a dear friend of mine, got out of Statesville Correctional Facility after doing a 30-year bid, he took up with his sister on South Halstead Street. Elijah, back in my time, you just wouldn't imagine that the young ones out there would figure that life was all about getting their people, who they never really spent any time with getting to know, to put a bunch of candles and flowers and big teddy bears at the place where they took the hit. It's like they figure that this is going to be their biggest accomplishment anyway, so they might as well get down to it. See, back in my time, if you were properly schooled, if you said, well, even though I do this thing on the street, I'm going to advance myself, well, then we had the organization to give you that experience of advancement. It might have never been a straight line. It was nothing like a ladder. You might have to go around a bit, circle back, be willing to step out into the world and bide your time somewhere else, and then bring back that time. But there was indeed a sense that you were going somewhere. We were going to rule Chicago. We were going to make sure that this city was for us. But now look, these young ones are making sure there is none of us left. Things have just spiraled out of control. Part 4, last part. Les Abricots, Haiti. Uh-oh. In what could be mistaken as the shadows of Chiesa dell'Immacolata Concezione e Purificazione de Maria, Frank Etienne, Jean-Claude Figuier, and René Filostete began writing projects in the early 1960s, invoking the form of the spiral as an aesthetic. This aesthetic attempted to both bore into the political dread of living in Duvalier-ruled Haiti and served as a way to exceed all the trauma of Haitian post-revolutionary culture. It was as if the potential of a revolution traumatic to the rest of the world, thus inviting years of repression, could be lived differently in place. Unlike many of their literary compatriots, the spiralists never left Haiti. Figlioli, in fact, served for several years as the mayor of Les Abricots, a small fishing town in the northwest. Their literary work avoided statements, instead opting for cultivating landscapes full of remains, full of detached details, not easily integrated into any specific program. For the spiral was the antithesis of articulation, the gathering up in its equilibration between centrifugal and centripetal forces is not an account. It's not a line evaluation, not a device that places things in a respective or respectable position. Figlioli's two primary works of fiction, Les Possédés de la Pleine Lune and Aube Tranquille, center on Les Abricots, a town long considered somewhat apart from the rest of the country. In these novels, the town is not so much inhabited with ghosts or spirits, but with multiple times. Times that remain unresolved. Times not relegated to a distant past. Each resident of the town embodies this ongoing reiteration of events that could still go many different ways. So all the turbulent phases of Haitian history, its times of slavery, revolution, terror, flourishing, and ravishing, live on in the midst of and through the doubled names, the doubled complicities and particular struggles of the town's inhabitants, in a fleshy concatenation of enduring matters of concern and singular strivings. The residents find themselves simultaneously in many different spaces and times. The divisions of public, private, personal are continuously inverted, so that the separations between secrets, memories, everyday performance, and individual torments and joys can no longer hold. Because they can no longer hold, this opens up spaces of continuous encounter, confrontation, and renewal. This is not a clarification of events, it's not a remaking of an old order, but rather a spiraling interpenetration of disjunctive chronotopes. No one is innocent, since each resident is affected by and affecting a blinding bitterness, self-preservation, and dissolution. Here, every resident works with each other in oscillating waves of harmony and disharmony, no matter where they come from, no matter how they designate themselves, no matter how they are designated by others. Speech comes and goes, and no perspective is confirmed as more accurate than any other. In these novels, Figlioli goes beyond the specificities of the vernacular, capable of accounting for the historical and present realities of the Caribbean. He is interested in the specificity of mobilizing Haitian religion, politics, and vernacular as a means of saying something about the larger planet, or more precisely of configuring a space without a world, something that cuts across all possible methods of demarcation and bounding. So on the one hand, it's about addressing a larger world, but the address is not in any way supplicating to that world. It's not in any sense respecting the boundaries of that world, but it's a way of addressing as a kind of way of cutting through that world, of abnegating some kind of larger frame of reference that would put Les Abricots in some kind of specific context. At one and the same time, his characters are completely diminished and trapped, but also simultaneously present and productive in a space which in its details certainly remains Les Abricotes, but which also encompasses spaces and times that render the town in infinite surface. The most localized events in the town derive from or impact upon pasts and futures on a wide range of sites. So in this, when he's describing the events that take place in Les Abricotes, all of a sudden you're on transcontinental airplanes, the high seas, different African cities, imaginary Caribbean cities, mystical undergrounds, banal European quarters. It's almost like turning the corner in Les Abricotes, and all of a sudden you're in these different kinds of domains. Feignole writes not to figure out a new place for Les Abricotes in a global world, but to deploy the town and its doubled and tripled embodied citizens as a means of deferring any possible congealing of a world to situate a place within. For example, in Les Possédés de la Pleine Lune, while talking about the main character, Agnore, a mysterious fisherman who's deaf and that of a double who looks just like him, the villagers account for his life in terms that know no boundary, know no resolution. Agnore didn't have any friends in Les Abricotes. Has anyone known of an enemy brave enough to confront him head on, even at night? Yes, the seven-headed beast. Agnore always boasted that he had chased it away. I wouldn't be surprised if it came back to avenge itself. Possible, T. Georges, but the village would have heard the violent noise of the beast, and its breath would have swept away the houses. That's true, but don't forget, Agnore always brought up the fact that the monster's 84 eyes regularly followed him during his nocturnal journeys. Hogwash, Andres. Why was he always the only one to ever see him? Agnore was just bragging. Maybe the deed was done by Lotores. What? Edgar, go on. That piece of garbage? I just don't see how. I do. T. Georges, vengeance increased his strength tenfold. Do you really think he had any left whatsoever after the thrashing Agnore gave him? And the coffee drinkers burst into laughter upon calling to mind that memory. They asked questions. Their answers fused together in laughter and rum. Each one of them might have been a certainty. Not one of them was the truth. At the same time, Feignole faces head on, and with brutal directness, the intensity in which Les Abricotes is immobilized in the real world within which it is inscribed. He wants us to know the capacity of Les Abricotes to become a universal force, a platform through which past and futures are inverted. He wants us to see how worlds can be turned upside down and precluded from restitution, but he avoids any trace of apocalyptic sentiment, replacing it instead with a narrative tone that simply accounts for the way things are and might be. Not as future promise, but as an adamant reminder of the simultaneity of the many folded into the present. At the same time, all of this does not make Les Abricotes into some romantic vestige or sufficiency to come. In fact, its power as a universal deployment comes from the very fact that Feignole makes no promises. Les Abricotes, he says, as if anesthetized, vegetates in a benumbing misery. The days pass without compelling us to do anything, nibbling away at the time we have left to live without us paying any attention. Left to ourselves in the depths of helplessness that no longer has a name because it has turned into an edifying resignation, we do not know the weight of the day nor that of the hours. Time is irrelevant to us. It became absolutely impossible to calculate the months and the years in those regions where its ruthless breath had raged. People everywhere got used to preferring that life be calculated as the time of our submission and our abasement, as the time of the beast. So when we consider all the places so intensely punished for both obvious and at the same time no apparent or justifiable reason, punished for the crime of their existence, punished in order to keep the crime from spiraling outward, remember that there is a crime, A crime that comes from the audacity of the poor, the oppressed, the subjugated, to dare have something to say everywhere, and have something to say that is not just about the conditions of their punishment, not just about their marginality, not just about their oppression, but nevertheless, at least in their hearts and their minds, they move outwards across distant barrios and deserts and bush, sterile and fetid landscapes, the mega and micro, covering the earth, not with their suffering, but with the care that comes from having endured nearly everything. Having never learned or been permitted to walk a straight line, and even as they seemingly move in circles, in spirals, with any fortuitous destination still a million miles away. Remember the vibrations of the movement of voice and feet fold us all in, encompass us all with some faint promise of being alone no more. Thank you very much.